Protesters gather outside the Japanese embassy in Seoul, like they've done every Wednesday for the past 27 years. They're here for the women forced into sexual slavery before and during the Second World War. This statue is a symbol now found across South Korea. It's meant as a reminder of what happened in the former Japanese Empire and of a historical injustice many South Koreans believe Japan has never atoned for. Tens of thousands of Korean women and girls were abducted and forced to work in military brothels across the empire. They were euphemistically known as comfort women. Many never found their way back home. And those who did only spoke up decades later. It led to a movement and the start of the Wednesday protest.
In the 90s, society had negative opinions of the victims. Society was more patriarchal. But since 2000, public opinion has changed a lot. It's no longer about anti-Japanese sentiment or nationalism, but an issue of women's rights during the war. That's why the movement is expanding and why so many are participating in the Wednesday rallies with happy hearts.
That happy atmosphere is reflected in the dance and music here. It contrasts with the painful memories of why they're protesting. Considering this protest has been going on since 1992, it's perhaps a bit surprising to still see the sheer energy and effort here. But the protesters are still saying they want what they consider a proper apology from Japan and justice for the comfort women. The legacy of Japan's 35-year occupation of Korea can be seen across Seoul. This is the changing of the guard ceremony at Gyeongbokgung Palace. It features ancient traditions and dress and marks a link between modern Korea and its past. But most of the palace was destroyed by the Japanese. The buildings today are reconstructions. And the palace guards are actors. The Korean monarchy was ended by Japan in 1910. It's been more than 70 years since the end of the Japanese Empire. Japan and South Korea are now both thriving liberal democracies and the two most developed countries in East Asia. They're surrounded by North Korea and China, countries with different political and economic systems and potential threats. And yet, ancient hatreds are hard to bury. Relations between Tokyo and Seoul are at their worst in years. In December, Japan said South Korea used missile targeting radar on one of its patrol aircraft. Seoul disputes that and wants Tokyo to apologize. And two Japanese companies might have their assets seized in South Korea after Seoul's Supreme Court ruled that they owe millions of dollars in compensation to Koreans forced into labor during the Japanese occupation. Yuji Hosaka occupies an interesting position. The academic is a Japanese-born South Korean. Despite his origins, he often puts the blame for the poor relations on Japan.
Korea's strength as a nation has grown, and that's why it started to speak up about things it couldn't mention in the past. Currently, the Abe government in Japan stands for historical revisionism, denying the Japanese invasion of Korea and Asia in the past. They believe Japanese colonial rule was right, and that it modernized Korea.
Japan's ambassador refused to be interviewed for this report. But the Japanese position is that compensation for mistreated South Koreans was settled in 1965. It says an official apology issued in 1995 should be enough. And considering the strong economic ties between the two countries, some South Koreans agree. Lee Seok-chun is a professor at Yonsei University. He says South Korea and Japan need to focus on the real threats in the region.
In truth, South Korea and Japan share similar ideologies and systems. Both governments have liberal democracies, while North Korea, Russia and China are under totalitarian rule. In that respect, Japan and South Korea have a lot in common and have to rely on each other. Because of the current leftist government, South Korea's hostility towards Japan continues to grow. We have to be vigilant about this issue, which is ruining the relationship between Japan and South Korea. Our ally is Japan and not North Korea.
The former sex slaves who began speaking up in the past few decades have become national heroes in South Korea. Their bravery in telling their stories led to renewed efforts to bring former sex slaves stranded abroad back home. But now, only a few dozen are still alive. Some live here, in the House of Sharing, a nursing home and museum. Yi Oxeon was a teenager when she was abducted by Japanese forces and was forced into prostitution for 3 years.
One day I was returning home after running an errand when 2 Japanese men stood in my way. They were dressed in civilian clothes, so I didn't know if they were the police or the military. They asked where I was going. Each took hold of my arms and dragged me away. I was sent to China. I ended up in Yanji City. I went through a great deal of suffering and pain. I was shot at, knifed, and beaten.
Oxeon eventually had a family in China. She didn't come back to South Korea until 2000. She was one of the few to return.
Some died in the mountains, some hung themselves, drowned, or died in other ways. What do we do with this anguish? When the Japanese invaded Korea, we were the weaker nation. Those Japanese invaded China and forced the women into sexual slavery. They were taken by force, men were conscripted, and women became comfort women. It was a living hell. I managed to survive.
The number of survivors is decreasing. Oxeon's neighbour was known as the Professor of Smiles. Her room is now empty. She passed away last month, leaving Oxeon with one fewer friend, and South Korea with one fewer first-hand memory of what's happened to its comfort women. Abubakr al Shamahi, The Newsmakers, Seoul.